So, welcome back to my channel, everybody, and welcome to this lesson where we are going to be looking at the formal and informal theatre spaces. Now, just take note, please, that this is a CSEC lesson, so we're looking at Forms 4 and Form 5, even though this topic is covered in Form 2, which I do have a recording of that. At this level, we look at it in a lot more detail and a lot more depth than we would have looked at it in the junior school. So if you are looking for the junior school lesson, then I'm going to attach the link to that. But we are going to go really in depth in talking about formal and informal theatre spaces in this lesson. So speaking of which, we are going to first of all try to distinguish between a formal and an informal space. We are going to identify and label the parts of formal theatre spaces, and we are going to identify the advantages and disadvantages of having performances in each of these spaces. So let's try to distinguish what are we talking about? What are the differences and perhaps the similarities between formal and informal theatre spaces? Now, a formal theatre space is one that is purpose built, it is designed specifically for performance, and it is used mostly for performances. On the other hand, informal theatre spaces may be used for performance, but it's not built specifically for that purpose. So it may have been adapted to cater to that purpose. So it may not have lighting capabilities, it may not have, the other technical capabilities like sound systems or backstage areas and things like that. However, it has its own features that might make it suitable for public presentation. So we're looking at auditoriums, we're looking at concert halls, as opposed to a space like a courtyard or a classroom. If we were to put on a performance in the street, things like that might count as informal theater spaces. So that's it in a nutshell. That's the difference that we're looking at. Was it built for a performance, or is it simply being used or adapted for a performance? So this is the real bulk of the lesson, where we are going to identify the the four main types of formal theatre space designs. So the very first one that we're going to look at is the proscenium. So proscenium is the most common type of theatre space, and the word itself actually comes from the Greek word meaning in front of the scene. And as you can guess, it would tell you that the audience is situated at the front of the stage. Now, the main feature of a proscenium arch, and as we go along, you'll get to know that the names of these different stages tell us quite a bit about how they are designed and help us to remember which one is which. Now, the main feature of a proscenium stage is the proscenium arch, which is like a frame. Sometimes it's not so much of an arch, but it's a frame that separates the playing area from the auditorium, and it's what we call the opening to the invisible fourth wall. So just imagine, when you look at a stage, it's almost like you're looking into a box, but there's one wall that's missing, and that is the proscenium wall. Well, it's an invisible wall, but that's where the proscenium arch is. So the seating is raked, which means that it is designed on an incline so that the people in the back row can view everything without the people in front of them blocking them. Now, this is a little bit opposite to how things initially were. And when we do the lesson about the positions on stage, we'll realize that why they say that the area closer to the audience is downstage is that once upon a time, stages were actually built on an incline, which sounds very uncomfortable, but it would mean that the part that is closer to the audience would have been down, that would have been the bottom part of the incline, and the part that's closer to the back of the stage would have been up, and that's why we call it upstage. So let's just look at a few pictures here of the proscenium stage. So again, looks like a box, and then there's the proscenium arch, which isn't such an arch in this one, but it is definitely a nice big arched shape in that one. Now let's look at the pros and cons of staging in a proscenium theater. Now, it's great for set and backdrops. Of course, it's really straightforward. You can put a backdrop at the back wall, which is well, not in the wall itself, but not the curtain or the big drape, the big white drape that is located at the back is called the cyc or the cyclorama. So it's really good for set. It's really straightforward to put things on stage when you need to have, big elaborate things. Very easy to set up light and sound. Well, relatively easy, as in easier than other spaces, because of course that is what it is designed to do. And people and things can be hidden in the wings when you don't need them off stage. So you don't have, in between scenes, the audience can see what's going on or the juicy things that are happening backstage. And another benefit is that the backstage area is very close to the playing area. So the cast can easily see what's going on the stage while they are not on, so they can judge when they need to enter or exit. And of course, that's very useful for things like if you have quick changes and things like that. You have the backstage area at your easy disposal. And it has many entrances and exits which we can access through the wings. Now, on to the disadvantages. The acting is somewhat unnatural, and I know a lot of students struggle with this because you constantly have to think about cheating out. You constantly have to think about opening out your body to the audience that is situated on one side. Whereas on a day-to-day basis, we use the full 360-degree angles of our body to face wherever we need to face. However, in the proscenium stage, since you don't want to give the audience your bum bum, you always have to think about kind of facing to one particular side when you're delivering lines and delivering action like that. So it tends to feel a bit unnatural. And this is a real struggle with students at first in remembering, oh gosh, I can't turn my back naturally as I would to speak to somebody or to pick up something when I am on stage. Now, the audience might feel distant. They might feel that distant. It's not very intimate because you have quite a big gap between the stage itself and the audience area. And of course, proscenium theaters are usually quite big as well. So if you're situated in the back row or on the balcony or things like that, you can really feel far from the action. So it's not best for things that are meant to be intimate performances, or you just have to try a whole lot harder to make people feel as though they are part of the action. And the acting has to really be exaggerated so the audience can see, because of course, again, they're pretty far from the action because the stage is set in and away from the audience. They're looking into it rather than the action looking out to them. So your actions must really be larger than life in order to project out onto all these people who may be situated, hundreds of feet or dozens of feet away from the stage. So let's look at the anatomy of a proscenium stage. This is the stage at SAPA. So this is the playing area or the stage itself. Of course, the playing area is the area that the actors have available for them to move about and to interact and to do their thing. The wings are at the side. Usually you have about 2 or 3 wings which are separated by really tall curtains that drop from the ceiling to the ground, and each of them is a separate wing. And you'll have them usually on the left and right, so those supply the entrances and exits for the cast and crew to the stage. Then, of course, our defining feature, the Proscenium Arch, which in this situation isn't so much of an arch, but we still call it one. And then, of course, the auditorium, which we also call the house, which is where the patrons, the audience, the visitors, the viewers are situated. So looking a bit more at the parts of a proscenium, the orchestra pit is one part of the theater that is pretty specific to proscenium spaces. So this, as you can imagine, is for if you have a production where you need a live orchestra and they're going to be right up under the stage so that they can see, so that sometimes you have a conductor. If the conductor is conducting both the orchestra and the performers or singers on stage, they can be right up there with the action. And of course, you have that close proximity so the sound doesn't go far. So if you have an orchestra providing musical accompaniment for something happening now, you don't want a delay, you don't want them to be in the back of the theater so they're hearing differently, or they're hearing a delay, or they're hearing an echo. You want them to really be as much a part of the performance without necessarily being on stage. Some proscenium stages have this little piece called the apron, which is right beyond the proscenium arch. It's like a little lanyard. It's a little piece of stage that extends beyond where the proscenium arch or where the grand curtain will fall. So this is a photo of an orchestra pit. As you can see, you have some performers right on the side here. I think here it's called the skirt, but we're not going to pay too much attention to what it's called. But you see the conductor is conducting them right here, as well as conducting the orchestra in the orchestra pit. And of course, the house lights are down, so the orchestra needs the lights on, their own blue lights on, so they can see their music. We don't want to have them in darkness. So now these are the curtains that we're talking about when we're looking at a proscenium stage. There are all sorts of different types of curtains, but these are the main ones. Now the tormentors, as you can see down the side, the teasers at the top. How do you remember them? I guess it's because the teasers, you only see just a bit of them. You just see a tease, and then the tormentors are these big draping curtains that you see the entire thing. The main one that I want us to learn is the cyc or the cyclorama, which is also called the sky cloth, which is basically a default backdrop, but then you can also use it for projections and to shine lights and things like that, to make the scene look different ways. So it's called the sky cloth because, of course, regular lighting, well, it's white, it's usually white, and then if you shine a very faint kind of blue light against it, it looks like the play is set against the sky. So these images are going to show you how, depending on the different types of light you use against the cyclorama or the cyc or the sky cloth, it can create different sorts of effects on stage. And this is what I was talking about in terms of it being good for backdrops and set, because you see the clouds coming in. And in these two different scenes, same performance, same play, but these two different scenes, the lighting against the sky cloth creates a totally different spectacle. Right, and we see it again here, really looking like a lovely piece of blue sky. So that's it for the proscenium. For now, we are going to go on to another type of stage, which is the thrust stage. So now the thrust stage is also called 3/4 round, and it is because the audience surrounds the stage on 3 out of 4 sides, so 3/4. It is basically the opposite to proscenium. So whereas in proscenium the stage is poked in away from the audience, in a thrust stage the stage is jutting out. It is thrust out into the audience. And this is actually the type of staging that William Shakespeare preferred. And an example in Trinidad and Tobago is the Central Bank Auditorium. So this is a photo of the thrust stage. Again, you can see that the audience surrounds the stage on 3 sides, and of course it is pretty intimate, because the action is happening up in your face, which can be pretty cool depending on the performance. So let's look at the advantages and the disadvantages then of performing or staging or mounting a piece of theater in a thrust stage. So advantage is that it's very intimate, and it allows you to establish a really good actor-audience relationship, and it allows for very big audiences, quite like proscenium, and you still have the use of the backstage. So just going back very quickly here, off through these side exits here, you will have a backstage area. So that is a plus because, there's always a lot of things happening backstage. And we quite often want them to be close to where the main action, the performance is happening. So the disadvantages, it has no curtains. Most times a thrust stage has no curtains, so any set changes have to happen in the view of the audience. Any set changes, any sort of changes, everything, once it doesn't have a curtain, has to happen within the view of the audience. There are limited entrances and exits. Most times you'll only have two entrances slash exits. And then all of your stagecraft, so your set, your props, your costumes, whatever, has to be really realistic because you're in the audience's face, right? Everything is right there. So as opposed to in Proscenium, where it's sort of black and you might get away with, the not so fine details because the audience is pretty far from it. They're really up in your business here. So they're going to see every little detail in the thrust stage. So this is just another picture again. You see that there's only one side of the stage where the audience are not situated, right? And again, so now this is one with a curtain, and you'll see just one entrance, one exit off the side, of course, when the curtain opens, and the backstage would be right there as well. So moving quickly along onto our next formal theatre space, which is the arena. Now, as you can imagine, arena is also called theatre in the round, and this is because the audience completely surrounds the playing area from all four sides. This image shows you a circular arena, however, more square arenas are pretty common as well. The entrances and exits are provided through gaps in the seating called vomitoria. You can't have entrances and exits anywhere else unless you probably go through the ceiling or something like that, right? So let's look at it in this particular diagram. These little gaps there where the audience will be able to go backstage, those are vomitoria. And you can look up the origin of that word. It doesn't have anything to actually do with vomit, but if that helps you to remember it, then fine. So this is an example of open air arena staging, which is very common in Trinidad for our Ram Leela celebrations. And as you can see, the audience, you can't see it too well here, but the audience surrounds the action on all sides, and there are lots of people standing around looking at this performance. But this, of course, is not what we'll call a formal theatre space because it's happening in a park. It's something that's adapted for performance. So let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages. Now, you can have a really large audience with the arena, and they can be seated pretty close to the playing area, quite like the thrust stage. The actor can develop a strong relationship with the audience again because they're pretty close, and there are several entrances and exits. However, you can't have too much set, you can't have too much scenery because you're going to block somebody at some point in time. Unless you have a big budget and you have a rotating stage, as some foreign performances do, you can't really have a backdrop because what are you going to hang it against? Probably against somebody's sightlines, right? And because of this as well, blocking is pretty difficult. You would think it's easier, but it's pretty difficult. And there are quite a lot of sightline issues just because your back is always going to be facing somebody unless you're lying on the floor in an arena space. And as I said, it is pretty easy to turn your back to much of the audience when you're delivering a line. So you really have to try to use, every inch of the performance. So the blocking can be a bit tedious. And the backstage area is not close to the stage because you have to pass through the vomitoria and then go to wherever the backstage is, which is likely to be pretty far because the vomitoria are also entrances and exits for the audience. So your backstage area might actually be underground, or it might be a little way off from the performance area itself. So if you have a quick change, it might be a little bit difficult unless you block off some of the vomitoria and reserve it for performance things alone. So we're going on to the next one. We are looking at traverse staging. Now, traverse is very similar to, or you might even call it a specific type of catwalk, and it is not very common. Basically, this is where the audience sits on either side of a rectangular stage. The stage is not always a platform as you see it in this diagram here, but in the next picture you'll see sometimes it's just, the surface of the floor that's naturally there. So the main feature is that the audience is situated on just two sides of the stage facing into each other. Of course, if they face out, they're not going to see anything except the backs of people's heads. So as you can see here, this is an example of a traverse stage that is not raised on a platform. There's nobody in the audience at the moment, but I'm sure you could imagine how they would look facing into each other, facing into the action. So some advantages and disadvantages. First of all, the seats are really close to the stage, so that could make it nice and intimate. The audience can feel really involved in the performance. It's easy for sound to travel, and the actors can be heard pretty easily because, of course, they're right there. And the audience gets a full view of the playing area. Anywhere you sit, you're going to see the entirety of the traverse, unless it's a really, really big auditorium. Now, disadvantages, the blocking can be really challenging due to the rectangular shape of the stage. It's a bit unnatural. There's more or less no backstage area, and there's only two entrances and exits on either side of the stage, and you can't use a backdrop or set either because you're going to block people. You're going to obstruct people. You can use scenery, but you're not going to be able to use a backdrop because, as you can imagine. Moving on to our next stage type, which is the black box stage. So now when we're talking about a black box, we are talking about flexible theater. As you can see from the image, it's basically an open empty space. Sometimes it's black, it's not always black. The color doesn't really matter, but traditionally a black box is black. And it has no fixed seating and no fixed staging. So basically you can configure whatever you want out of this space, and that's why they call it flexible theater. So it can be altered to suit the needs of your particular performance. You can put the stage where you want, you can arrange the audience however you want, and things like that. And then use, of course, the lighting and sound capabilities to complement your performance. So let's look at some examples here of different staging. This is from one performance in a black box. You can see there's not much going on in terms of set, scenery, lighting, things like that. This is from the same performance. We see the use of multimedia through the projections here, and otherwise the projector screen is sort of just acting as a backdrop. Again, you see, freedom to move about things and create different things out of the scene. This is from a performance called Mansplain that happened in Trinidad Theatre Workshop. This is a picture of a black box space. Now, it's usually used for experimental performances and sort of studio performances, quite often student performances as well. So this is a black box space that used to be used in my university, and I'm going to show you two videos of two separate performances happening in the same space and just how different they can look even though they're literally happening in the same place. So you can see very cool use of multimedia, use of the projections and the shadow work there. And then this is a completely different one, which was a durational piece. And you almost wouldn't believe, it's just very, very short clips because this lesson is long enough already, but you wouldn't believe that it's the same space that's being used. You can literally do anything that you want to do with a black box space. Well, almost anything. So that's what we're going to look at now. What are the advantages and disadvantages? Now, first of all, it can accommodate almost any type of performance. It's extremely flexible. However, it is best for smaller things, small audiences, small productions, and it does create a very intimate atmosphere because it's smaller than most theater spaces, and it is easy for sound because it's small and square. So you have pretty good acoustics unless you have a really tall ceiling or something out of timing like that. Disadvantages would be that it's not very suitable for big, elaborate productions. But for most of the things that we want to do at CSEC level, for the student type things, yeah, black box theater is really good for us. And a lot of times our classrooms form our black box theaters in our own schools as well. So now we're switching over for a second to finish off with some of the informal theatre spaces. The first one being open air theatre. And of course, all of these headings are coming straight from the CSEC syllabus for theatre arts. So open air theatre being the first one. Now, open air is a designated theatre space that is outdoors and it has an established location for the stage. So it basically has features of an indoor theatre and an outdoor theatre. It is set in one place, there is a stage, and just sometimes the stage may or may not be covered, but the audience, in most cases, is situated outdoors. It's commonly called an amphitheater. There are many amphitheaters that we can identify in our local spaces. So it might take on different designs according to the location. It might be a sort of arena amphitheater, proscenium, and a kind of proscenium-ish amphitheater, a thrust, that kind of thing. So it has no ceiling, it has no walls except maybe a back wall, and sometimes, as you'll see in the images coming up, the stage is covered. An example, of course, being the Naparima Bowl Amphitheater. Now, let's be very careful to know the differences between open air theater and street theater, which we're going to talk about in a second. Now, open air here, you can see this is the Naparima Bowl Amphitheater while a performance is not going on. And of course, you see it's open to the elements. But here, this is while a performance is going on, and you can see basically they open the back door to their actual normal proscenium stage, and the back door opens out into this outdoor space. So it really is quite nifty. Very bad for air conditioning, but it's quite a smart design, right? And you can see that most of the stage is covered except for this little apron here. Now, this is a complete open air performance which happened in a particular area outdoors that usually has, protests and public speeches and that kind of thing. But yeah, so open air completely happening in one established location. So let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages, which I think would be quite easy to conceive. There's a very unique experience of being outdoors, of course, being one with nature and all of that. That's the main advantage. Disadvantages are quite a lot. Firstly, it's quite difficult for sound because the sound is not contained in a room. It can travel wherever it wants to go, and that can be pretty difficult to get everybody to hear as well as we want them to hear. And then bad weather can literally make a performance impossible. If it's too hot, if it's too cold, if it's too rainy, too windy, too anything, then it can be really tricky when you're dealing with open air. So that's, contingencies that you definitely have to cater for when staging a performance like this. And our final type now, we're looking at street theater, which is somewhat similar, but not really. So street theater is also called promenade theater, and the difference is that it may not have, most times doesn't have a specific paying audience because it literally happens in the streets. It happens in your very ordinary places where people will be walking and associating on their day-to-day journeys. So basically anybody who's on the street can view street theater, and in most cases the performance actually moves through these public spaces. So it might start at the bottom of High Street and move all the way up to Library Corner, or it might start on one end of the promenade and move to the other end of the promenade. So there's no one single stage. It happens in the street. This is in most cases. And you might be thinking, okay, what types of performances happen like this? Of course, carnival, but not Trinidad Carnival alone, but carnival performances are typically, the most prototypical example of street theater. Canboulay reenactment, a lot of reenactments of riots and things like that. So the Labor Day parade, that kind of thing, happens in street theater. Traditional carnival portrayals and flash mobs. The Good Friday Stations of the Cross as well in Trinidad and San Fernando Hill. It starts at the bottom of San Fernando Hill and makes its way all the way up onto the top. So let's look at some images here of street theater. We see, of course, traditional carnival presentation of the baby doll interacting with strangers who are our audience on the street. Again, you're going to see a lot of traditional carnival presentations, of course, because that is the home of carnival, where the people are, where the heartbeat is, in the streets. So let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Now, first of all, it's open to the public. Most of the times it's free of charge, because you can't make people pay to see things that are happening right where they are, where they are based. Which can be an advantage or a disadvantage depending on the type of performance. So the audience can enter and exit as they please, which can be an advantage or it can be a disadvantage. The performance itself can move around, and it can be very interactive. So you can interact not just with the people who are viewing the performance, but also with the different spaces. How might a performance that happens near to a green space differ from the performance that's going to happen in the middle of a city? And it could happen anywhere, in a car park, in a forest, in a mall, anywhere. Now, disadvantages, it can be really difficult to set up. You need police presence, because most times they're going to be obstructing traffic flow. If it's not that it's actually happening in the road itself, you're going to have macro traffic where people are stopping to figure out what is going on there. It can be difficult to set up sound equipment, especially if it's a roving piece. If it's a piece that's moving, that means your sound equipment also has to move with you. And it can be difficult for the audience to see, especially if you're short, because there's no designated seating in most times. So you might have to peep and stand up on a tree stump, stand up on the pavement, stand up here, stand up there, to be able to see exactly what's going on. And the biggest disadvantage is that the street is so unpredictable. There are lots of distractions. Cars passing, playing music, the typical hard pong, people making noise, anything. Just think about the amount of distractions. If you were to do something focused and intimate in a street area, it would be pretty difficult to mitigate the distractions. So just to close off, let's recap. We learned that performances can happen in formal and informal spaces. So basically, anywhere you have an audience, you can have a piece of theater. And we learned that the main designs for formal theater spaces are proscenium, thrust, arena, traverse, and black box. And then the informal theater spaces are mainly open air and street, which are both somewhat outdoors. So thank you very much. I know this was a bit of a long lesson, but I hope that you learned a lot, and I'll see you in the next one.